12 speeches. That is all the Federal Reserve has given the public since its last meeting. The average for this point in the calendar is 23. Something is being kept quiet, and the man behind that silence just stood in front of Congress and called the last decade of Federal Reserve policy a mistake to their faces, on the record. If you hold gold, if you hold silver, if you hold anything priced against the US dollar, do not look away for the next few minutes, because what he said next was not meant to reach you this early. There are 5 task forces working right now inside the Federal Reserve, and their findings will reach 19 people before they ever reach you. By the time you read this in the news, the decision will already be made. Stay until the end, because the date now circled on every trading desk on Wall Street is closer than you think. Before we go any further, welcome to Stick Zennn. Now, if you are the kind of person who reads the newspaper cover to cover every morning, who checks the gold rate before checking your phone messages, who has seen enough decades pass to know when something serious is being said quietly, then you already belong here. So do us a small favor, the way you would help a neighbor who asked for a hand. Look down at your screen right now, find that subscribe button, and press it. It costs you nothing, and it means this channel can keep bringing these briefings straight to you before the headlines catch up. And while you're at it, tell us in the comments, which city, which country are you watching this from today? We read every single one. Now, let us go back to where this story truly begins. 12 speeches. That is the number of times Federal Reserve officials spoke publicly since their last meeting. To understand why that number matters, compare it to history. Going back to 2022, the average number of speeches at the same point in the calendar was 23. That is nearly half. Wall Street noticed this drop before ordinary people did. Analysts who track every word from the Federal Reserve saw the pattern early. And when they studied the numbers closely, they did not call it a coincidence. They called it a signal. The man responsible for this silence is Kevin Warsh. He has served as Federal Reserve Chairman since May of this year, but his story with the Federal Reserve did not begin there. Long before he took the chair, Warsh spent years outside the institution as one of its harshest critics. He was a former Fed governor who later became a relentless voice against everything the Federal Reserve had turned into. Before he was ever appointed chairman, Warsh gave an interview that barely made headlines at the time. In that interview, he made a promise. He called it a regime change, not a small adjustment, not a minor policy tweak. A complete regime change at the institution that controls the value of the money sitting in every American's pocket. Most people who heard that promise assumed it was simply campaign talk. Political leaders often make bold statements before taking office, only to soften them once the responsibilities of the job settle in. That is what everyone expected from Warsh, too. That is not what happened. On July 14th, Warsh appeared before the House Financial Services Committee. These were the same lawmakers who had confirmed him in what was described as the most divisive Federal Reserve vote in history. Many expected him to be cautious in front of them. He was not. Warsh directly criticized a specific policy by name. It was the framework the Federal Reserve adopted back in 2020, a policy that allowed inflation to run higher than normal after years of very low prices. At the time, the Federal Reserve defended this approach as smart and forward-thinking. Warsh called it something else entirely. A mistake. He said, without hesitation, that the Federal Reserve was not the first central bank in history to ask for a little more inflation, only to end up drowning in far more than it expected. Think carefully about what this means. This was not a new chairman criticizing a decision made decades ago by people long retired. This was a sitting Federal Reserve chairman standing in front of Congress, criticizing a policy from 2020. A policy defended publicly by his own predecessors. A policy still fresh in the minds of millions of Americans struggling with the cost of living. And he said it anyway, on camera, in a hearing room, with reporters watching every word. For someone so new to the position, this level of directness is unusual. Most incoming Federal Reserve chairs spend their first year being careful. They avoid bold statements. They build consensus quietly behind the scenes. Warsh has done the opposite from the very beginning. He has spoken less publicly than his predecessors, cutting the total number of speeches nearly in half. Yet when he does speak, his words carry more weight, more certainty, and more consequence than expected from someone this early into the role. This combination is what has business leaders, investors, and everyday Americans paying closer attention than usual. A chairman who says less but means more, a chairman who openly criticizes his own institution's recent history, and a chairman whose actions suggest that the real decisions may already be happening quietly, long before the public hears a single word about them. What happens next builds directly on this foundation, because the fewer speeches and the blunt public criticism are only the beginning of a much larger shift taking place inside the Federal Reserve right now. Inside the Federal Reserve, something unusual is taking shape. It has to do with information and who gets to see it first. Warsh revealed that his 5 internal task forces are quietly reviewing nearly everything about how the Federal Reserve operates. These task forces are looking at communication strategy. They are examining the Federal Reserve's $6.7 trillion balance sheet. They are even reviewing how the institution collects its own economic data. But here's the part that should concern anyone paying close attention. These task forces will report their findings first to the 19 members of the Federal Open Market Committee. These are the people who set interest rates for the entire country. They will see the conclusions. They will discuss them. They will react to them behind closed doors long before a single word reaches the public. Only after that process is complete does Warsh plan to share anything with the outside world. Read that again slowly. The people making decisions that affect every business, every loan, every mortgage in the country will always know what is coming before anyone else does. To his credit, Warsh did offer one clear promise. He said any proposed change to that massive balance sheet would be explained and debated publicly before it is ever put into action. No sudden surprises there, at least according to his own words. But notice what that promise does not cover. It does not cover interest rate decisions. It does not cover what those 5 task forces conclude before their findings are finalized. It is a narrow promise, sitting inside a much larger pattern of saying less and deciding more in private. This is where a phrase now spreading among people who study the Federal Reserve closely comes from. They are calling it a family fight. This phrase describes real disagreement happening inside the committee right now as inflation pressure builds again, oil prices climb, and costs tied to the massive artificial intelligence investment boom begin pushing prices higher across the economy in ways few people expected. Warsh has not tried to hide this disagreement. If anything, he has leaned into it, confirming that tension among the committee's 19 members is real, active, and far from settled. Now consider a number that should catch the attention of anyone holding gold or silver as protection against uncertainty. At the beginning of this month, traders believed there was roughly an 18% chance of a Federal Reserve rate hike at the next meeting. Within less than 2 weeks, that number nearly doubled to 36%. This did not happen because of one dramatic headline. It happened because of a steady stream of serious signals coming directly from the chairman himself, through testimony and public speeches. Warsh has repeatedly stated that prices remain too high, and that his committee has no patience left for letting inflation continue. This is the deeper pattern hiding underneath everything Warsh has said and done since taking office. He's not simply changing what the Federal Reserve says. He is changing when the public finds out what the Federal Reserve has already decided. Fewer public speeches than history would suggest. Task force conclusions shared with policymakers first. A chairman willing to state blunt, 3-word judgments on inflation while staying quiet about what comes next at the following meeting. Strip away all the noise, and what remains is a Federal Reserve that increasingly makes its decisions in private, only revealing the outcome once everything has already been settled. This should sound familiar to anyone who has studied how gold behaves throughout history. Gold has never needed a financial crisis to rise in value. It has only ever needed one thing: a widening gap between what a small group of insiders already know and what the rest of the public is finally told. And right now, by the chairman's own design, that gap is not shrinking. It is widening on purpose as a matter of stated policy. What this means for the coming weeks, and for anyone holding physical metals right now, becomes even clearer when the story moves to the global stage, where Warsh made a statement that traveled through trading desks worldwide in seconds. Travel back to late June, to a small city in Portugal called Sintra. Every year, the world's most powerful central bankers gather there for a forum that rarely makes headlines outside financial circles. This year was different. Warsh stood on that stage and delivered a line that spread through trading desks around the world within minutes. Prices are too high. Just 3 words. No qualifiers, no mention of temporary factors or special circumstances, no careful language designed to avoid alarming markets, the kind of language central bankers have relied on for decades. Just a plain statement of fact, delivered by the one man who now controls the most powerful financial lever on the planet. He was not alone on that stage. Sharing it with him was the governor of the Bank of England, who used his own remarks to raise a separate warning. He pointed to rising leverage building up across bond markets, hedge funds, and exchange-traded funds. He described these as tail risks, hidden dangers that could trigger real financial instability if conditions suddenly changed. Picture this scene carefully. 2 of the most powerful central bankers in the world standing on the same stage in the same week. One warning that inflation refuses to fade away, the other warning that hidden risk is quietly building inside a financial system that looks calm on the surface. That combination, inflation danger on one side and hidden leverage on the other, is exactly the kind of environment where gold has historically performed its strongest work throughout history. But there is another force building underneath all of this, one that most people have not connected yet. Energy prices have been climbing again. Brent crude oil has pushed past $84 a barrel, with West Texas Intermediate trading close behind. At the same time, A newer and less familiar source of inflation has been quietly building strength. It comes from the massive wave of investment pouring into artificial intelligence infrastructure across the country. This includes data centers, computer chips, and the electricity needed to power all of it. This kind of spending does not stay confined to technology company headlines. It creates real demand for materials, labor, land, and electricity. That demand eventually shows up in the price of nearly everything built using those same resources. Warsh has acknowledged this directly in his own public comments. He has admitted that the technology investment boom sweeping across the economy carries real inflationary consequences, alongside whatever benefits it eventually delivers. This is a surprisingly detailed and careful position for a chairman who otherwise prefers blunt, three-word statements. It suggests something important. Warsh is watching this dynamic very closely, aware that it complicates the simple hope that inflation will naturally cool down on its own as last year's price shocks fade away. Professional strategists have taken notice of exactly this combination of pressures. One well-known chief global strategist, reviewing the same information Warsh was responding to, stated plainly that the numbers all but ruled out any rate cut at the Federal Reserve's next meeting. She went further, warning that rising energy prices, combined with growing concern about artificial intelligence, spending pushing costs higher across the economy, kept the possibility of an actual rate hike this year very much alive. Read that carefully. This was not a casual comment from a market blogger. This was a professional strategist at a major financial firm, putting her reputation behind the idea that the Federal Reserve's next move could be upward, not downward. Now here's a detail that almost nobody outside professional trading circles has fully connected yet. The Federal Reserve's next scheduled meeting takes place on July 28th and 29th. Most officials are expected to leave interest rates unchanged at that specific meeting. But multiple analysts, studying the exact same signals covered so far, believe the real turning point will not arrive there. They believe it arrives at the meeting after that one, in September. That is the date now circled on trading desks across Wall Street, the moment when the disagreement quietly building inside the committee room may finally force its way into the open, whether Warsh wants it to or not. Think carefully about why September carries so much weight. By then, the Federal Reserve will have 2 additional inflation reports, 2 additional employment reports, and a full quarter of new data showing whether the cost pressures tied to artificial intelligence spending are accelerating or slowing down. It will also arrive right after several of those 5 internal task forces are expected to complete their work. If those task forces conclude what Warsh has argued for years that they would conclude, that the Federal Reserve's old framework needs a genuine overhaul rather than a light adjustment, then September becomes the moment those private conclusions finally start turning into visible public action. What all of this means for anyone holding gold or silver right now becomes even clearer once the full picture connects together, and that is exactly where the story turns next. Every time the odds of a rate hike shift the way they did over the past 2 weeks, nearly doubling in a matter of days, the effects do not stay contained to bond traders and hedge fund managers. They spread outward, quietly, into everyday financial life. Mortgage rate offers move. Credit card interest calculations move. Auto loan pricing moves. Businesses planning their spending for the second half of the year are forced to recalculate their borrowing costs. None of this happens instantly or visibly, the way a stock price jumps on a screen. It happens slowly, over weeks. It shows up eventually in a loan rate that is slightly higher than expected, in a business approval that comes back with different terms than planned, in a decision to delay hiring or delay expansion simply because the cost of borrowing money has become harder to predict than it was a month earlier. This is the part of the story that rarely receives the attention it deserves, because it does not happen in one dramatic moment. It builds slowly, and it builds fastest, during exactly the kind of transition the Federal Reserve is going through right now. A new chairman rewriting long-standing rules. A committee openly described as fighting internally, and a public receiving less real-time information about where any of it is heading than it has received in years. Think carefully about what this means for someone deciding right now whether to add physical gold or silver to their savings, or whether to hold on to positions they already own. The case for precious metals in this environment is not built on predicting exactly when the Federal Reserve raises rates, or exactly how high prices eventually go. It is built on something more basic than that. It rests on a simple truth. The advantage held by insiders, the people who know decisions before anyone else, has widened on purpose as a matter of stated Federal Reserve policy. This is happening at the exact moment multiple sources of inflation are building at the same time. Energy prices are climbing again. A historic wave of technology investment is pushing up the price of materials and labor across the country. A sitting Federal Reserve Chairman has publicly rejected the idea that any of this is temporary, and a committee split internally enough that professional analysts have started calling it a family fight in print, using those exact words. Gold and silver do not require anyone to correctly predict how that internal fight ends. They simply benefit from the uncertainty of not knowing. That has been their basic function for centuries, long before Federal Reserve statements or interest rate meetings existed at all. There's also a global dimension to this story that deserves attention. Warsh is not operating alone in this moment. He shared that stage in Sintra with central bankers from countries around the world, each one facing remarkably similar pressures at the same time. Inflation that refuses to fully retreat. Energy markets shaken by ongoing conflict in different parts of the world. A wave of technology-driven spending, reshaping demand for everything from electricity to skilled labor. When several major central banks face the same set of pressures at the same time, their decisions begin to influence one another. Each surprise from one institution makes the next surprise from another institution more likely, not less. That kind of interconnected uncertainty is precisely the environment in which gold has functioned as a global store of value for centuries. Not because any single country's central bank makes a mistake, but because the entire system built on trust in coordinated, predictable policy starts to feel less coordinated and less predictable all at once. None of this guarantees a specific outcome for prices. It simply describes the conditions accurately, using only what has already been said publicly by the people whose decisions move these markets. What anyone does with this information depends entirely on their own circumstances, their own timeline, and their own judgment. But walking into September without understanding the family fight building inside the Federal Reserve, without understanding why rate hike odds nearly doubled in a matter of days, without understanding that a sitting Federal Reserve Chairman has openly called his own institution's recent decisions a mistake, is a far riskier position than knowing the full picture and deciding from there. If the chairman of the Federal Reserve is willing to stand in front of Congress and call his own institution's recent decisions a mistake, the real question becomes how much confidence anyone should place in whatever his committee decides next. September is approaching quickly, and the people who understand what is happening beneath the headlines will be the ones who are ready for it, long before it arrives.